Okay. Again, my name is Connie Silva, and I'm the Director of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to get started, and I just have I'll take a few minutes of your time to tell us a little bit about our project. To begin with, I want to let you all know that you are currently muted. If anyone accidentally gets unmuted, we will mute you here on the back end just to make sure that all of the line is quiet enough that everyone can hear the speakers. So please don't be offended. Sometimes that happens accidentally, and we'll take care of it on our end. Okay, and let me go ahead and begin. We know we are expecting more people, so we'll have folks entering the room as we continue. But for right now, I want to let you know that I have other members of my team here with me, Sharon Falk, who is our Assistant Director, Susan Stewart, who's our Technology Coordinator and here running our webinar, and also Davina Gallen, our Administrative Assistant, who's in the background as well. So what we're going to ask you to do is take a moment to, in chat, go ahead and put your name and your district. If you're with a team like we are and we don't get to see all of their names, you could go ahead and put those in chat as well. Just gives us a good sense of who's on our webinar with us before we move over to a presenter. So I'm going to keep speaking while you all do that so I don't, again, end up using valuable time. I want to take a few minutes. I know many of you have been on our webinars before and are familiar with our project, but for those of you who have not, just going to take a couple minutes here and run through what we do. So we are a project funded by the California Department of Education, and we provide assistance to those districts that are interested in disproportionality, and with a big focus on those that are actually identified as significantly disproportionate. So we do webinars like this that are open to anyone and everyone. So they're open for the general information on dealing with issues that really do impact disproportionality. We also do community of practice meetings. Those are virtual meetings, and those are with districts that are identified as significantly disproportionate, so there's more of a closed event. We have a website, and you'll see the URL there, SPPTAP.org. There's lots of resources on there, and all of that, again, is available to anyone who's interested in learning more about what we do and about disproportionality and equity and how to improve systems in schools to support all students. We do ongoing assistance, so anyone who's interested in getting some more direct support from us or information, you're welcome to contact us, and you'll see that we have emails and phone numbers all over the place. So you're welcome to, again, there's our email, in fact, right down there at the bottom, where you can reach Connie, that's me, or Sharon. Okay, I'm going to leave that up for just a second, and I'll move on to our next slide. So for this webinar, we want to encourage all of you, again, to use chat to participate. So you right now hopefully are putting your information. I can see a lot of names and information going into chat. There will also be polls. So during the webinar from time to time, you'll be asked questions either to write into chat or a quick poll as well. So again, we want to make this as interactive as possible, so please do put in your questions and your comments. Reminder that we are recording this session. All of our webinars, as I said, are available to anyone who's interested in viewing this. If you're not able to view it live or even after the fact, if you want to review some information, our webinars are archived and put on our website. So everything that you currently view, including chat, is part of the archive. So just want to let you guys be aware of that. And I'm going to go ahead and move us. That was good and quick. We have two different presenters today. Our main presenter is Dr. Kent McIntosh from the University of Oregon, and we'll be passing the screen on to him in just a little bit. But we also have another one, Michael Lombardo, who is he's the coordinator for the PBIS Coalition. So we're going to start with Michael, and he's going to tell us a little bit about PBIS in California, give us some information about what the coalition is doing and coalition members. So I'm going to end up passing it to Michael, but before that, I do want to take a minute just to introduce Dr. Kent McIntosh. We're very fortunate to have him with us today, and his presentation is going to be on implementing PBIS with a racial equity lens. So Kent McIntosh is a professor in the Department of Special Education and Clinical Sciences at the University of Oregon and Director of Educational and Community Supports, which is a research unit in the College of Education. He's co-investigator of the OSEP National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS and lead of the center's disproportionality work group, and has worked as a school psychologist, teacher trainer, and teacher in both general education and special education. Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye and go ahead and pass it on. And as I said, Michael Lombardo from the PBIS Coalition will be speaking first, and then Dr. McIntosh. Michael, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Oops, sorry about that. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm not going to take up too much of your time, and I want to get to Kent so he can tell us about PBIS with an equity lens. But I did want to let you know a little bit about the California PBIS Coalition and the supports that we have available to you throughout the state. So just real briefly, the coalition is here to support people in California, sites that are implementing PBIS. We help create a standard of practice for the state. So our focus is on implementing PBIS, utilizing the PBIS blueprints and the national model for implementation. We're organized and support schools and districts through a series of professional learning community meetings. We usually host 2 or 3 learning communities each year, along with a series of webinars about every other month that are open to the community with topics like this. We focus on systematic implementation and support in schools through creating a network of leaders throughout the state to help complement, share strategies, and support each other in your implementation. And then we have regional TA or technical assistance centers in the North, Central, and Southern Californias there to support county offices and local school districts in implementing PBIS. So where are we right now? Here's a nice graphic of where the TA centers are. We're hoping to add technical assistance centers more towards that white area in the middle of the state and the north, but these are individuals who can help you scale up. I also want to add that there's many county offices that aren't listed here who are implementing just in their county, but these county offices or counties illustrated here, regional technical assistance centers, are providing supports within their county as well as to other county offices and school districts to help scale up PBIS. So what are our activities? I mentioned a few of these earlier as I was introducing myself, but we would like to focus on coaching and creating a coaches network across the state. We do, as I said, host monthly webinars and have a website for your support at pbisca.org. Newsletters come out about every 3 months or so during the school year, and we provide core technical leadership meetings to individuals in districts and county offices throughout the state. We like to form ourselves into a leadership community throughout the region. So you can go and visit demonstration sites at the school level, talk to implementers who are implementing preschool programs or high school programs, whatever your interest is. And then I'm going to talk more about our state recognition system, and I didn't want to leave out our conference. We host the California PBIS conference each year, and we're very excited about that. Last year we had about 1,200 participants here in Sacramento. And we created this conference here as an opportunity for implementers in the state to come to a local conference in California and experience national level speakers, but also implementation sites locally. So the PBIS recognition system is a way for us to help support schools and acknowledge such an important part of PBIS, right, is to acknowledge what we're doing, celebrate our successes, and focus on recognizing schools and districts throughout the state that have done such a good job at implementing PBIS. In 2016, we had 509 schools, and that grew almost doubled in 2017 to 954 schools. I'm very excited. This Friday, we're going to launch our 2018 recognition process. We have a webinar and Fortunately, it's sold out, but it will be recorded. So if you're interested in learning how to participate in the state recognition process for PBIS, visit our website and you'll be able to see a recording of the webinar if you're not already registered. This next slide, I'm just going to click through real fast. What I really enjoy about this slide and want to show you is the transition from schools from bronze to platinum. So you can, in silver, you can see the increase in the number of schools. The first year we had 173 schools that were recognized in silver, and that increased by 385 schools to 558 schools. What this tells me, at each level of recognition, we have increase in requirements to demonstrate outcomes and use tools like the tiered fidelity inventory, which Kent is going to talk about at length later in his presentation, but I wanted to mention it briefly here for you now. So the tiered fidelity inventory is a way for us to recognize and assess your level of implementation. It's a way for you to identify how you're implementing at each tier, and it's a way for us to help understand how we can support you. So we're always looking at the data from the tiered fidelity inventory. But we're excited about the growth at silver, gold, and platinum level. So the growth of PBIS in California, you can see, has definitely increased over the years from our start in 2000 to now. Our latest numbers in 2016-17, we have over just about 2,600 schools, a little bit over, implemented PBIS, either in general education or alternative education. In this slide, the red portion at the top shows the addition of alternative education sites, and you can see alternative education sites are increasing as part of the growth of PBIS in the state. Across the top, you can see where the California Coalition was formed in 2011, and some significant events like Assembly Bill 114, the transition of special education services to the schools and districts from county mental health, the local control funding formula. Then we had 15 awards in California for the School Climate Transformation Grant, and then our California dashboard. And I added these to the slide because I feel like those are part of the drivers that are helping us to see more sites implementing PBIS in the state. So here's California compared to the rest of the United States. We're leading the way. We're super excited about that. We have the most number of schools. But then when you look at our number of schools per capita, we're less than many states in the U.S. So we're very hopeful that this is growing. We have so many schools in California still yet to reach. Currently, about 1 in 4 schools is implementing PBIS. As you can see by this slide, we have a long way to go to help support kids and student outcomes. Who's implementing? We know that elementary schools are the highest level of implementers in the state, all the way down to middle high schools. We don't see it here, but I did want to illustrate that there's a growth of elementary, middle, and high schools at each level of grade level, but as well as each year. So for all grade levels, we're seeing an increase in the implementation of PBIS. Don't see that slide here, though. I'm not going to talk too much about the tiered fidelity inventory because Kent's going to talk about that. But just know that this is a resource for you to use through PBIS assessments and a way of measuring your level of implementation of PBIS at your school and in your district. And it's a way of districts looking at multiple school sites to look at how are we implementing what we said we were going to do with PBIS. Are we doing it to fidelity? And we know that 70% or better on the TFI helps sustain practices and helps to see academic and behavioral outcomes for students. Skip over that. We know that schools are increasing their use of the tiered fidelity inventory. In California, I believe, has the most number of users of this tool, and that's actually approaching almost 100%, just so we're probably about 700 schools less that aren't using the TFI, but it's pretty widely used across the state. Here's our scores for the TFI. So we know as a state, we're reaching that 70% mark in Tier 1. So you can see on the left side of your screen, each year that people have been implementing PBIS, we see a growth in the level of implementation. So this slide really excites me because I know that people who are implementing PBIS are doing it with Fidelity and at an increased amount at all three tiers. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McIntosh, the person you came to hear today, and thank you again for having me here. And if you have any questions, please contact us at the Coalition and at our website.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate the work that you're doing and everyone in California is doing to really grow this initiative with just amazing quick growth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend some time, I'll talk a little bit about PBIS in general, but I'm going to spend most of the time looking at how you can implement thinking specifically about equity in terms of race and ethnicity disproportionality in school discipline. And what I'm going to share with you are a number of resources that we've made available for free from the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS. And it comes from a large work group that we have focused specifically on equity. And a lot of really, really smart people have put together some of the resources that I'm going to share with you. And even though I'm the only person presenting from this group on the webinar, it's really them that you need to go ahead and thank. But what I want to do is start us off a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, just entering a couple really quick things about what you want to get out of the session today. I know there are a lot of you out there, so if you can type real quickly, I'm going to take a look and see what things that you're seeing that you want to get out of the session for the next hour, a little bit over an hour. Provide a little bit of think time here. I know some of you are already just coming in and getting your names out there. And I know some of you are still working on getting audio. All right, so here's some things that are popping up. Does research support that PBIS reduces the discipline gap? I'll talk about the research out there. Practical strategies for implementing in high schools, absolutely. Buy-in strategies, particularly looking at disproportionality and suspensions. Okay, so far the winner is concrete strategies to take back. Here's some people saying they're seeing a decrease in use of exclusionary discipline. I use exclusionary discipline to describe suspensions, expulsions, office referrals, going to a refocus room for a good chunk of the time, or in-school suspension. So people seeing that there are good effects of PBIS, but there's still a discipline gap there. That's great. This is good because you were in the right place. This is what we've targeted this presentation for. So thank you for sharing there. And I want to start with a quotation. This is from a magazine called The American Educator, which is the official magazine of the AFT. And I think it really describes a lot of what we run into these days and why we're all here. Many schools, particularly those in high poverty districts, operate in a crisis management mode. Often our students display anger, frustration, and hurt in ways that feel, and often are, defiant or disrespectful to educators. There's no magic bullet. The effectiveness of responses hinges not solely on individuals, but also on whether school cultures facilitate relationships between students and educators, have open communication, provide opportunities for school-family collaboration, promote cultural awareness, and offer professional development to help teachers manage stress. In other words, we cannot place systemic responses on the shoulders of individual educators. The days of having to be a superhero teacher who steps in and heroically, against all of the system's odds, saves people's lives. You know, you can be a superhero for a very brief amount of time. But to be able to do that consistently and to be able to have a full staff of superheroes all the time, we've got to make it much easier for us to do our jobs. And that's why having a systems focus, instead of this idea that every educator must have all of the answers to all of their problems, close their door, and handle their classrooms all on their own, just doesn't work as well as collaborating on behavior support and building those positive school cultures. So speaking of which, and thinking about PBIS as a way to collaborate together and use a systems approach, I've got a poll that's going to pop up here, and I'm going to ask you how many years that you've been implementing PBIS in your current role. It could include never, not going to do it, no way, no how. It could move from just getting started right in the beginning, that fragile implementation, been doing it for a while and are sort of looking at what's next or what to do, or have been doing it forever and ever and ever. And so if you want to, you can add it into the chat, but you should have a poll that pops up and you can just click right on there and see. And it'll do a little bit of a live take on here. Okay, so most people are in this 2 to 5 years. We've got a few just getting started. We've got a few in your first year. I'm assuming because many of you are administrators that you actually have, you might be thinking about your initiative, and in that initiative you may have schools that you're thinking about trying to get on board. You've got schools that have been doing it for a little bit and are kind of still needing startup support, and then you've got some schools that have been doing it for, you know, that 2 to 5 year period. So that's great. Thank you very much for answering that there. This is going to be particularly helpful for those of you who are in that zone right there. But it's also going to be helpful for people to just get started as well. All right, so to give you a little bit of a background so that we're all on the same page, I'm going to do just a brief description of PBIS and why it can be particularly helpful as a framework for equity intervention. Some of you may have seen these 4 circles, the overlapping circles, and they're a very useful way of describing how PBIS is different from other initiatives or other frameworks or interventions, for example. So one of the things you notice is the big blue circle of outcomes. Everything that's done in PBIS is related to improving outcomes. And I came to PBIS later in life. And one of the things that really drew me to PBIS was that there was nobody out there telling me what were the outcomes that are important for me to address. Instead, the best thing about PBIS is it says, what are the things that are important for you all? And then implement the interventions, the strategies, the practices, the programs that will actually get you to meet those valued outcomes. So many places, many schools, many districts, we'll have sort of a couple big ideas of social competence and academic achievement. But you may very well have increasing graduation rates. You may have students graduate career and college ready. You may have equity in school discipline as your big outcomes, and that's great. You can make PBIS systems work to meet those outcomes. Then the elements that fit within, number 1 is practices. This is what we're most used to. These are the things that we do specifically with students to support their behavior. Anytime you're interacting with a student, more likely than not, you're putting these practices into place. We're all familiar with what those are. One of the things that makes PBIS different is there are also systems in place to support staff in putting those into place, as opposed to just assuming we've given you the training and now you're pulling it off. So in this case, here's a school that's using a team to put things into place to support the adults in the building, as opposed to just saying, here's a program, go teach it. And then the fourth element is data, and particularly using a little bit of information that helps guide whether the things that we're doing are working, whether we need to make a change, or whether what we're doing is totally not working at all and we need to scrap it and do something that's more worth our time. So in that case, actually collecting a little bit of data for decision making can actually save time for us. Here's an example of data there. Now here are some things that PBIS is not. So number one, it is not a specific program. It is not a package that you buy from somebody for $10,000. In fact, everything out there is free, and you should be able to find anything you need to implement on the web because people have taken it, they've tweaked it, they've shared it, they've posted it. This whole idea of symbiotic stealing is particularly helpful because it means that you're not stuck with buying a 3-ring binder that has a program that says you have to do it this way, this way, this way, and it doesn't match your school. And that's particularly important when we think about implementing with an equity lens. Number two is that it's not for a specific group of students. It's for everybody. When we focus on building a positive school culture, we are talking about teaching everybody what that is so everybody knows, and knows not only that they know, but knows that everybody else knows as well. And then the last one is that PBIS is not a big new thing. And even though Mike showed that huge growth in PBIS implementation in California, schools in California have been doing PBIS for more than a decade. And the strategies that they've been using have been used for 60 or more years in education and been shown to be effective. Mike showed the California data. Here are some broader data from the U.S. So what you can see here is each one of these is school years across the bottom. And as of August 2017, which are the same data that Michael showed, we've got over 25,000 schools in the country implementing PBIS. And not only implementing PBIS, but implementing with the support of the National Center. So we actually think this might be an undercount of the number of schools. If it's just a school that says, yeah, we're doing it, we watched a webinar and now we're implementing, that does not count in this list. Almost 14 million students being supported by PBIS. And it's not just in the U.S. We actually have PBIS implementation, not supported by the National Center because that focuses on schools in the U.S., but over 20 countries around the world implementing PBIS in schools, which is pretty exciting to see. Some new data that just came out in terms of a data brief. If Jessica Swain-Bradway and colleagues did what's called a benefit cost analysis, looking at the cost of implementation compared to the benefits. They found some pretty surprising results. For every dollar spent implementing PBIS, there were $105 in savings from reducing school dropout. And that was based on implementing PBIS, reducing suspensions, reducing the risk of school dropout, and then the cost of school dropout on society, which were some calculations that were made in the state of California for looking at how we could change percent of suspensions and actually save society a whole lot more money than spending on that. So that's pretty exciting. So Mike talked about fidelity of implementation. I actually see a few people talking about fidelity of implementation in the chat, and I like to use this example of fidelity of implementation. I end up flying around the country a fair amount in doing this work, and every time I get on an airplane, I take a look in the, I'm not looking for like, is there room for me to put my bag up? I take a look in the cockpit, and this is what I want to see. Here's the co-pilot, and what she is doing is she is going through a checklist of everything that needs to happen to make the plane fly safely. You can look at everything behind her, and there are tons of dials, there are tons of flashing lights, there are knobs, there are levers, there's all sorts of stuff, and she is focusing on the most critical things because it's really, really important for us to do that. All right, I'm seeing maybe that I'm slightly lost here for a second, but hopefully you can still hear me okay.
Yep, we sure can.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm back online. Fantastic. It's a good thing that was not a plane because that would be a lot of time I'd be lost there. So here's the thing that's really interesting. She's focusing on fidelity of implementation. Here is a school team that is doing the exact same thing. They are using a checklist, the tiered fidelity inventory that we were talking about before, and that tiered fidelity inventory is just like that co-pilot's checklist for making sure that the plane flies safely. And remember how I was talking about how complicated flying a plane is? I am going to argue that implementing a systems level intervention really well is actually way more complicated than flying an airplane. So they need that checklist, and that checklist, as I was describing, is the tiered fidelity inventory. So our definition of fidelity of implementation is the extent to which the critical features of PBIS are implemented as intended. And there's two really good reasons for assessing fidelity of implementation. Number one, if we've got an evidence-based practice like PBIS, then it actually helps us improve outcomes for students because we put more of the things that work in place and it continues to fit. But the other part, and this is really, really useful, is we can look at what we've done and we can celebrate what we've done, and then we can also look and say, what are the next steps to get us to full implementation? Not worrying about a specific percent and saying, oh yeah, we got 70%, so now we're all done, now it's all completed. No way. We want to make sure that we're doing all of the things because each one of those parts are really important. Here's one of the things that we're trying to avoid. Take a look and you can see what we might have here. So you see it says, welcome home of the dogs, and then the sign below, no dogs. What we want to watch out for is when we're building a school climate that is positive, that is predictive, that supports students, we want to make really sure that we don't build one that ends up excluding some students just based on their backgrounds, based on their learning history, maybe based on the color of their skin. So we want to be really careful that those positive outcomes that I was showing before actually meet outcomes for all students, not just the majority of students. So here are 4 reasons why PBIS could be an effective framework for enhancing equity. Number 1, and I borrow this from one of my favorite teachers, Anita Archer, who says that when we assume that students know what's expected of them, we are committing assume-icide. And what she means from that is we might get what we call unwanted behavior, and we get that maybe because students are being willfully defiant, or maybe because we haven't been really clear about what we want students to do. So what we want to do is make sure that we move to teaching the hidden curriculum as opposed to assuming students know it and then nailing them when they get it wrong. Number 2 is anytime we want to think about working with students, it's really, really key. And one of my colleagues, Ann Gregory, talks a whole lot about the importance of building positive relationships for both school discipline and enhancing equity in school discipline. And what we want to think about is that when we add in our interventions, we might think about, when we work with students, about building a relationship bank account. And anytime we've got a positive interaction with students, that adds money into the bank account. And anytime that we have to make a withdrawal, and we know that sometimes we have to make a withdrawal on that bank account, the most important thing that we need to know is that if we make a withdrawal, we do not want to have it come back with that slip that says insufficient funds. That way we are in big trouble. Number 3, our research and the research from other people are showing that the more objective your referral procedures and your discipline procedures, your definitions, and what happens, the more equitable your school disciplines are. The more equitable your school discipline outcomes are. So what that means is ambiguity in our discipline data systems, in our procedures for handling students, is disproportionality's best friend. And then the last one. If all we provide for teachers is excluding students from instruction, we're going to run into a lot of trouble. So we need to provide our educators with more tools than simply sending a student out of the room, excluding a student from the activity, sending a student to the hall, sending a student to the office, sending the school to in-school suspension. You can't punish skills into a child. You can only teach the students those skills. And that's absolutely critical when we start thinking about what's the reason why a student might get sent out of the room, or what the student might, the reason for a student might get sent to the office. Okay, so here's some data. I know somebody was asking before about, do we actually have evidence that PBIS reduces discipline disproportionality? We have some evidence in the research literature that's mixed. Some that says it does, some that says it doesn't make a difference. We don't have much evidence that says it actually makes things worse. But here's some data showing the out-of-school suspension risk index. So what that is that's the percent of students who have been suspended out of school at least once during the school year. And this is the most recent data. This comes from the Office of Civil Rights. You can see it's 95,507 schools. All of the schools in the country is that blue line. So what we would say, if we were to look at that bar all the way on the left, 5% of students overall were suspended at least once, 1 out of 20. Then in the green bar is schools implementing PBIS to criterion, meaning adequate fidelity of implementation of Tier 1 PBIS. And so what you see here is if you look for all students, it's 5% schools implementing PBIS, 4%. So it's not a big difference. It's a little bit lower. And if you look, they look about the same all the way across, but here's some other things that you see. For black students, it's about 2% lower. For multiracial, it's about 2% lower. And so these are some places where we see some differences. And what I look at that is I say, well, we don't really have evidence that it increases the discipline gap. We have some evidence that it decreases the discipline gap. But even so, we should assume that if we implement just sort of standard PBIS without attention to race or ethnicity, without attention to culture, we should not expect to see full equity in school discipline. But I view this as, here's a promising start, and what are the things that we need to do to enhance that even more? So based on that, we from the National Center on PBIS have developed a set of recommendations for addressing discipline disproportionality in education. And this is our list of 5 right here. You may have some things that you're doing that are not on this list, and if you're doing them and they're working, by all means keep doing them. But this is what we've found in terms of our data, in terms of other people's experiences, that if you're missing something, these are the things to focus on. Number one, collect, use, and report disaggregated discipline data. Number two, put a behavior framework like PBIS or something else that's preventive, so it has an instructional focus, that's multi-tiered, and is flexible enough to meet the needs of your students, their families, the community, and your staff as well. Number three, use engaging academic instruction that connects with students, or you build on students' prior knowledge, that students are much more involved in instruction than simply a stand and deliver kind of approach, to reduce the opportunity gap, what some people call the achievement gap. Build policies, as I was saying, to reduce ambiguity and have accountability for disciplinary equity, and teach strategies to neutralize implicit bias. I just did a webinar for APBS, the Association for Positive Behavior Support, on that, just that last bullet point specifically. So if you're interested, you can go to apbs.org, particularly if you're a member, and you can move a little bit more closely to that. But today, in this webinar, I'm going to talk specifically about number two. Okay. So some researchers have looked, not just is PBIS related to equity in school discipline, but are there specific parts of PBIS that are more related to equity than others? And so there have been two studies looking at this. There have been two separate samples. There have been two actual separate fidelity of implementation measures. And here are the things that they found. Number one, regular use of data for decision making was actually related to decreases, or a decreased discipline gap, decreased black-white discipline gap. Implementation of classroom PBIS systems, same. And then two studies showing that the larger percent of fidelity of implementation of reward systems or acknowledgement systems, the lower the discipline gap. So that sort of points to this idea that we might have a discipline gap, and that discipline gap might be related to an acknowledgement gap that we have as well, that we're not actually recognizing the positive behavior of students of color as much as we ought to. All right, so moving on here, what I'd like you to do, just really quickly, because I do want to make sure to continue on with our content here, and answer some of the key points that some of you are raising, hopefully towards the end. What one or two or three words would you use to describe cultural responsiveness? Being a warm demander. Excellent. So that's that idea of actually having really high standards for students, holding students accountable, but doing it in a very supportive way. Respect individualized. Making sure all are accountable. Okay. All right, understanding and acknowledging what students bring to the table, yeah, as opposed to just assuming the sort of empty vessel approach of you come in and I fill you up. Using student culture in teaching. Colorblind, I'm hoping that usually my definition of cultural responsive is actually the opposite of colorblind, that we're actually hyper tuned in to culture. And in that sense, we don't treat all students exactly the same. We actually use their culture to enhance their learning. Recognizing behavior as such and not as the person, right? It's not that you're the problem. It's that there's some behavior that's getting in the way of you being successful. Sure. All right. All right, so moving forward, I'm going to share with you a three-part definition of cultural responsiveness that I like, that we've been using. It doesn't have everything in it, but it's got some of those things. It's a definition that Jeanette Klingner and colleagues have used. Number one, holding high expectations for all students. That's that warm demander, that's that accountability component. Number two, using students' cultures and experiences to enhance their learning. Okay, so not just recognizing that they're different, but actually using that as part of instruction. And then number three, and this one sometimes is a little bit of a big one, providing all students with access to effective instruction and adequate resources for learning. And I will say some of our big-time school funding allocation decisions that are often out of the hands of us small fish educators do a whole lot to promote inequities out there. So based on the idea that PBIS is a framework that has some potential, based on the idea that it doesn't always reduce or completely eliminate the discipline gap, and the idea that cultural responsiveness is a pretty broad, for some people, kind of a squishy definition that doesn't really tell us exactly what to do, we've put together a guide. This is particularly a guide for trainers and coaches, not just for school teams to share. And this cultural responsiveness guide has a few key parts to it. There are resources for building identity awareness, and I'm actually talking more about staff identity awareness than anything else. There is what's called the TFI Cultural Responsiveness Companion. I'm going to walk you through that mostly. And then there are a lot of resources in appendices, including lesson plans, including activities. So one of the things that you shouldn't do is just print off this thing, because it is going to be huge and enormous. But looking at it electronically and figuring out what are the parts you want to take out of it is going to be really key. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time here talking through what some of those resources are. But like I said, this is free. You can go online. You can download it right now on our equity webpage and grab it. And I'm going to introduce you to a number. We'll take a look at a few activities. I'm just going to give you page numbers for other ones, so you've got a chance to look through some of this in greater detail. But it's connected at the second part, the CRC, or Cultural Responsiveness Companion. We need a few more TLAs in our lives, meaning three-letter acronyms. And so we need the TFI-CRC, which is, I don't know, maybe that's a six-letter acronym, but we'll see. But what this Cultural Responsiveness Companion does is it lines up with the TFI so that you can ensure that your systems are being implemented with cultural responsiveness in mind. So somebody commenting before was talking about, well, the TFI doesn't necessarily honor what we're doing in terms of cultural responsiveness, or we're not getting points for that. Well, this is not a scored tool, so you still would complete the TFI just as it is, but for each one of the items on the TFI, for the Tier 1 scale, it lines up really, really well. So it, just like the TFI, it's got your 15 critical features of behavior support, and the Cultural Responsiveness Companion, for each one of these items, talks about the big idea in terms of PBIS, identifies concepts related to cultural responsiveness, and then provides non-examples, examples, activities, and resources. And so the non-examples are intended to say, what would it look like if you thought you were doing PBIS, but you weren't attending to culture? And then what would be the examples of that? What would be the change that would move that to a much more culturally responsive element of implementation? So here's an example. This is 1.3. So most of you are familiar with school-wide behavior expectations. You can see here's the big idea up at the top. School-wide expectations are brief, memorable. You know what all of those are. And if not, don't worry. I'll go into them momentarily. And then here's a cultural responsive elaboration. It's making sure that the expectations that you adopt, because you've got some flexibility in doing that, actually reflect the values of the community, of the students. that you actually identify what the expectations are and then specific rules or the examples that you might have based on a legitimate purpose, not just as this is sort of how school has been. So you see non-examples in the middle left, and then examples in the middle right, and then you see some activities and examples and tools to use right there. So here's what we recommend, and I think you can approach this in a few different ways, but knowing that this is a big tool, knowing that you can't just plunk it right in front of a team and say, here you are, this is how to do it, here's what we recommend. Number one is assess the need for identity awareness for staff, and I'm going to share with you an activity in just a moment. Complete the TFI, and then use those TFI results in a few different ways. So number one, you could look at the strengths of the things that you had in place or mostly in place and say, okay, how do we even take some of this work further? Or you could look at priorities. What are the things that you want to identify that, that you've got next for implementation and make sure you're implementing with cultural responsiveness in mind? Or you could go through each of the 15 items of the cultural responsiveness companion. That's going to be a lot to do, so I want you to be cautious about doing that unless your teams are really, really up for it. I have found it more helpful to use this as a guide for me as a trainer and say, hey, here are a couple areas that I think might be useful. Here's an activity that you might try out. And instead of saying this is the thing to do or you should do each one of these, think about a few bins. So I'm going to talk about a few activities that line up with critical features of PBIS Tier 1 implementation. And then, of course, you're going to take that and put it into your action plan. So I'm going to ask you a question here, and I'm going to ask you to answer in your chat box. And this is a little bit of a different question, and you might not have thought about that too much. But what do you think would be one or two words that the students in your schools might use to describe your school's behavior support system? This is not what staff would use to describe. This is what words would students use? And I'll just take a look at the chat here and see what I can find. Unfair, punitive, non-existent, racist, yeah, color-coded. They do not support us. So maybe the idea that the behavior support systems support the teachers and not the students. Works for some, not for all. Inconsistent. What is it? Got lots of unfair as well. And some of you, as you're typing in, I'm going to move on from here. Oh, not relevant. That's a good one. Some of you might be wondering, I don't know. I don't know what my students would think about it. Or I think they would think it's inconsistent, but I'm not entirely sure. So the best thing to do, of course, as if you haven't figured it already, is ask them. And we've got a new survey that you can use to get input specifically from students about the PBIS or other behavior support systems that you've got in schools. And it has this long name of the Stakeholder Input and Satisfaction Survey. We have an elementary version and a middle-high version. We actually have a family version, and we have a staff version. These are still just being tested right here, and so so it's not on, if you're familiar with PBIS assessment, where you may have entered your TFI data, your self-assessment survey data, or something like that. This is our testing site, which looks exactly like the other ones, but it has a few other ones that we're testing out to make sure that we've got it. Oh, look at that. Susan has put the link right there. Just be aware that if you're a coordinator or if you're working with a coordinator, you may need to request access to field tests. It's not automatic, but we can obviously help you out with that. And if you need to, you can always ask me. But I'm going to share a little bit of info on this one. It's an electronic survey. It is anonymous, so you get a link and use it just like the self-assessment survey if you're used to that. So you could have students do this at a computer lab. You could have them do it on their own time. whatever. What you see is you've got a bunch of demographic information, and then you can actually get your data disaggregated by groups here. But I want to show you highlight a few of the questions. Look at this one, expectations. Do you know how your teachers want you to behave at school? It's actually one of the strongest non-academic predictors of achievement. What are they? So you've got a knowledge test in there, and so you can see that there are these open-ended questions. Are the expectations meaningful or important to you? In the elementary version, we just asked, do you like them? If not, what do you think they should be? Are they the same as they are in your home? If not, what's different at school? Trying to get a sense of how much code switching students are having to do, jumping from school to home to neighborhood. A few other things. There's a second page on here. This one, remember we were talking about acknowledgement systems being really, really critical to equity in school discipline. In the past week, did you see teachers or staff reward or praise other students for following expectations? Did they reward or praise you for following the expectations? Remember, you're going to be able to look at this disaggregated. And then a question, if so, were you rewarded or praised in ways that were meaningful to you? If not, how could it be more meaningful or more important to you? So you're starting to get this idea. This is not a checklist. This is actually a way to get some anonymous student voice into your systems so that they can answer that question about describing your school's behavior support systems much more positively. Last part, look at respect. Here's an interesting one. Are students at your school respectful to other students? Are students at your school respectful to teachers? Are teachers at your school respectful to students? And are teachers at your school respectful to other teachers? Remember, we are always modeling behavior for students. And if we are treating the other adults in our buildings with disrespect, students are going to see that. And they're going to assume that it's okay if that's true. Okay. So if you're interested in this, what you can do is just contact your PBIS assessment coordinator, ask them about it, and see if you already have access to field tests. If you don't, you can ask support, or if you really need to, you can just email me, and I can help you out with that. Just make sure you're getting the PBIS assessment coordinator emailing me so I can grant that person access. So now let's look at some of the core practices of PBIS and how we can make them all more culturally responsive. I'm going to move through some of these a little quickly because I'm assuming that you know some of them, and I'm going to spend more time on the culturally responsive elaborations on here. So number one, define school-wide expectations or social competencies or however you call them. Number two, teach and practice them. Number three, monitor and acknowledge pro-social behavior. Number four, provide instructional consequences for unwanted behavior. And number five, make decisions based on your data. So let's go through number one in particular. All right, so here's an example of some school expectations. I'm sure you have figured out that this is the non-example. Look at all those negatively stated things. Think about how students would feel if they walk into a building and this is the first contact they have with the school behavior systems. Much better, more positive, more focused on big ideas of how to work together with people in life, as opposed to what are the things that you're doing that we all don't like and don't want you to do. What we know from the research on PBIS that it's related to is here are the core parts. Small in number, they're broad, so they can cover just about everything. They're memorable so that we know, and they're positively stated. The reason why we want them to be small in number and we want them to be memorable is it's really important that we as adults in the building and the adults in your buildings use the language of the school expectations on a regular basis, that it becomes the anchors of your social curriculum. You hear people describing, I see some people being respectful to each other, and this is an example of what that looks like. And that's going to be a really helpful way of looking at it and encouraging students. Here's another example of expectations. This is I believe this is Everglades Park in Florida, where I took this picture. Hikers and bikers move to the side of the road when a vehicle approaches, and you see all the alligators on the side there. One of the things that's really key here is to ask ourselves, are the rules that we have for students, are they actually useful for them, or are they only useful for us? Are we teaching them compliance, or are we actually teaching them life skills that they would regularly use? So I'm going to share with you a way to work through making this a little bit more, how you might reflect on your staff identity and how that might inform the expectations or values that you find. So this identity awareness activity, it's in page 45 of the field guide. I'm going to walk you through what that looks like right here. So it is an activity for staff. So you would have this done at a staff meeting, at a half-day in-service, at a release, some release time period. This is not necessarily what you would do with students. I guess you could do it with students, but we're really thinking about staff for this. And it's a way for people to reflect on their personal values and reflect on how those values actually change over time, shape the school culture, and might be different from others, and particularly students and families. And then how those differences could create conflict or cause some of the challenges that we're running into. So let me show you an example page. This just has some of the items here, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of what that looks like. So what you've got is each one of the rows here, other than the header row, has a different element of culture. And then what you've got across the top in the column are spaces for people to fill in for each of these. We've got my values growing up, my values now. What my school values, how might students and families be different, and how this difference might create conflict. And so the elements of culture, it really doesn't matter which ones you actually pick. The thing that's important is I usually start something up top that's a little bit less touchy and a little bit less of a scary, you think this is going to bring up a lot of tension ones. I usually put those down to the bottom. But I think it's really useful actually to use your school data and identify where do we think we've got behavior incidents that might be related to cultural mismatch or differences between the culture of staff and the culture of students and families. And so then what you do, you just basically have people fill out this, fill out the matrix or fill out this worksheet, and then talk with a neighbor. And what you find is you get a chance to review on your own, and then talk. And we can talk. You can talk about one element. You can spend more time. This is something where you could easily spend 45 minutes or an hour on, or you could do a little bit less. You could do it a little bit more brief. But one of the things that I think is really, really helpful for this, and I'll pop this back up here, is it brings out a lot of ideas that you might want to raise with your staff, but that it might be better if they come to that idea on their own as opposed to you just lecturing them on it. So one thing that might be useful if you're thinking about, gosh, I would use this, now what do you think you would use across here for elements of culture? So what would be the things that would go in the rows? So I've got appropriate personal space, voice level, dress, response to insults. What would be some things that you would add in there that you think would be really important for staff to reflect on? And while you're typing in there, I'm going to share with you a couple of the ways that I've used this that has been helpful. One thing that I've found useful is the first two columns there that are blank, my values growing up versus my values now. It's particularly helpful to look at that to give people a sense, because sometimes people get this idea of like, no, there are universal human values, and there are good values, and there are bad ones, and we all know what they are, and we all know what a lack of values is. And I think that it's very useful to have people to reflect, and sometimes you can have a joke one up there or something like that, where people really see that their values change over time. I often share that that the teenager in me, me as a teenager, would vomit if they saw what I wore as a professional adult presenting to staff. And so that's a big difference in dress over time where things have changed. A lot of times people also ask the question, well, I don't know what my school values. I don't even understand how to answer that. We don't really have school values. And my answer to that is, yes, you do. Any time that we're actually teaching a social curriculum, we are identifying what is valued and what is not valued. And it might be implicit or it might be explicit. And then how my students and families might be different. Instead of just saying they have a lack of values, this is when maybe they're operating under a different value structure. And then that's why we might create some conflict. So I'm just going to look through a few here. Body language, facial expressions, eye contact, yep. How I act as a good listener, yeah, that's really important, right? And that actually is probably related to the eye contact idea. Appropriate ways to disagree with somebody, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that, as I'm thinking about that, a great high school example in California, one of the things they found is that a lot of students were getting into really heated political conversations. And they needed to teach specifically how to disagree with somebody in politics while still remaining respectful and responsible. And that's something that's really important. Verbal turn taking, timeliness. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. I was just talking with a colleague in North Carolina, and she was describing that she had gone back and traced her cultural roots to Ghana, and she went and did some professional development over there and figured out she started getting really frustrated because nobody was ever on time in Ghana, and somebody pulled her aside and said, we operate under a totally different value structure, meaning that if we all started on time, then we would be systematically excluding some groups of students, some groups of staff in this case. And the people who we would be systematically marginalizing are the people who don't have access to reliable transportation, have more difficulty getting there, and so their value of collaboration and equity was more important to the community focus than actually starting on time, which is kind of interesting. So you got lots of really good ideas up there. These are fantastic, and I think would provoke a lot of really interesting discussion without having to do a professional development day with somebody lecturing with them about that the whole time. A lot of people have a good sense of it, and if they don't have a good sense, then they can rely on the other staff around them. So you can examine your expectations and your matrix for fit to see, because more often than not, your team built a matrix on their own. Your team probably doesn't reflect the racial and ethnic makeup of your students. And so it's really important to check in and ask yourself, do our expectations and does our matrix actually line up, or are there bits of bias in there? So we've got an activity for how to do that and some guiding questions. Here's a school that totally revamped their expectations. This is a school in inner city Hampton, Virginia, and they had a sort of generic teaching matrix. I think it was be safe, be respectful, be responsible. They were recognizing that it just wasn't working for them. So what they ended up doing is using a teaching matrix where they changed their expectations entirely to swag. So if you're not familiar with it, swag or swagger is sort of being prideful or boastful about something that you can do. And some people, well, a lot of people view that as a really negative behavior. But they were saying, you know what? Actually, being proud of yourself, showing off that you're really good at something, would actually be like, that's not a bad thing. So they said, well, what about if we could have students reframe it so students are showing swag by actually being pro-social with each other. So they've got their expectations: safety first, work together respectfully, accept responsibility. And then this fourth one down here is guide me. That's not the expectations that students have, that teachers have of students. It's actually the expectations that students can have of the adults in the building for supporting them. And of course, one of the core things that's very, very important and sometimes people don't cue in on is the matrix always needs to apply equally to adults as they do to students. We can't say do as I say, not as I do, because the students are going to watch what we do, and that is going to create problems right there. And then using that survey, using the family survey that's also connected to there, and you can still get on that field test site as well. For those of you who are in high schools, there's a great activity I stole from my colleagues in the Netherlands called the Rules Gallery Walk. You get students to actually walk around the school and take pictures or document all of the rules around the school, and then ask, then you put them all up on butcher block paper all around like an area like an auditorium, and ask really pointed questions. Is this positively stated? Does it fit within some of our other expectations? Could we reframe it? What are the underlying values that this rule promotes? And sometimes we find out that the underlying values that are promoted are, you guys are really annoying and get in the way of me trying to do my job of teaching you. Not so great. I also really like the idea of taking your matrix and giving it to students and taking out all of the specific examples, or what sometimes we call the rules, that are in the boxes, and asking students to come up with them. You get a lot of good information from students on what are the things they actually know and don't, and then you can revise your matrices so that it's in much more student-friendly language. Also, creating a student and or family equity advisory board. So you're specifically reaching out to families and students who are being marginalized by the school system and learning from them about what would help pull them in as opposed to push them out. Some of you also kind of might reject the idea of expectations, that this is all about adults placing students saying this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, and it feels a little bit coercive, or that we're teaching compliance. And there's nothing in PBIS that says that you have to call them expectations. Nothing at all. And so you might call them our values or our agreements. You might not even talk about that. You might just say this is so built into the culture of our school that this is the Thunderbird way, or something like that. Here's a school where it's just built right in, the Bulldog way, and you've got this really nice imagery. It's all laid out. It's just built into the sides of schools. So this might be a way that works better than saying these are our expectations of you, because we're really talking about these aspirational values instead of things we want you to do. So of course, what's important is that it still has all the critical features. What you call them doesn't make a difference. The key thing is that we use them regularly. Sometimes one little assessment of whether you've got expectations that fit your staff or that fit your students and staff is if people don't remember them or don't use them regularly with students, it's a good idea to check in to see if they're the right ones. All right, so I've got a lot to do in the next 15 minutes, but I think I can pull it off. In terms of teaching and practicing expectations with students, got to have a plan to teach. It's got to involve what we do at the start of the year to make it really easy for everybody to pull it off. We've got lesson plans, we've got a schedule. It's easier for you just to do it than not do it. And then you've got a plan for when you're going to do those booster sessions and use your data to figure that out. Of course, teach the expectations in the actual settings. I could tell you plenty of stories of my failings in teaching when I taught the recess expectations in the classroom. Turns out it doesn't work. Oops. You got to teach a rationale for it, teach the actions, and teach students to discriminate the difference between expected and unwanted so that they have that line in their minds. So you take this matrix, you take them and you build that right into the lesson plan right there for you. Take it and teach it there. This is, of course, a hallway expectations lesson because they're out there in the hallway, and you can see the lesson plan right there in the binder. So some of the adaptations for this. Number one, including students in both planning, designing the lesson plans, and actually pulling them off. A little example of that. I'm going to share another thing, and I'm going to do this a little bit more briefly. But it is an activity that we go into great detail in the guide called a personal matrix. And a personal matrix, sometimes people call this a behavior dictionary, it's a tool for individual students to assess how they move from situation to situation and varying expectations. Instead of trying to explain to you what it is, I'm just going to show it to you and give you a little bit of a sense. So this is an activity not like the values activity that you do with staff. This is something you do with students. Here's a school with their expectations: be safe, be respectful, be responsible. And at school it looks like these are written in for students. So it says these are the ones where you might have like all settings all the time or everywhere. And then what you see is there are two other columns that are blank. At home it looks like, and in my neighborhood it looks like. So here's an example. So each student is going to be different, but here's a filled in one. You can see here's a student who has written in perfect Comic Sans. And this is really helpful. So what you could do this anonymously, but I actually recommend having students write their names on it, and you collect it and review it and notice what you see. So you're going to look at this, and you're going to find some really interesting things. One of the things that we want to be really, really careful of is avoiding what's called deficit language, but thinking about students and families in ways that say, oh, they don't have values, or they don't have the values that we have, they're not being successful in that way. This is really helpful for you to look and say, it might not be that students have an absence of values. It might be that students and families are operating on a totally different set of values that are equally worthwhile, but just aren't the things that we focus on in school. So you can look here and you can identify where are some things where students might look at those school expectations and look at them really differently than the other ones. So some of the things that you see here, the school ones look a little bit more like individual responsibility. The home and neighborhood looks a lot more like looking out for others and a little bit more of a collective view of values. And you might actually identify places where what we're asking students to do are the exact opposite of what students know. So if you take a look up at the top, you see tell an adult if there's a problem for be safe. So that's a pretty common thing that we want students to do in schools. But if you look for this student in my neighborhood, that would be the exact way not to be safe. And so when we find those, that's really, really useful for us to look at. And there's a few things that we can do about that. And I'm going to skip through this here so that we can make sure to get through some more of the slides here. But what you do, oh, and here's an example. This shows that we actually do it for real. This is a matrix that is very, very useful in terms of identifying students' lives that are really, really different. Here's a student who, if you look in the top right corner, says that the worst thing, the way not to be safe in your neighborhood would be around police officers. That's something that's pretty useful for us to know. So when you see those differences, you ask yourself, and this is how do you adjust for the academic or formal environment. What you do is when you see similarities, you go, okay, that's good. We can sort of highlight these. But if we see big differences, we ask ourselves this question: are those different school rules absolutely necessary for positive student development? And there are going to be times when it's not. It's just sort of, oh, well, this is sort of just the way I grew up in school, so this is just how it is. And it's not a particularly useful way of looking at it. So we can just change our rules in school so that students have to make less of a leap. But there might be times where we say, you know what, we do actually have to have different rules in our school. And those rules might be because we want to teach something really important that's a life skill. Or there might be so much variation that we can't say, well, let's just totally change school to match students' home life. Okay, well, which students' homes? Right? That's the thing about the personal matrix, is they're all going to look different. But a key thing for us to do is when we are asking students to do something in school that is different from how they do it at home, how they do it in their neighborhood, a key thing to do is acknowledge that we're asking students to do something different than how they're expected in other places. And if you learn nothing from this presentation, one of the things that I think is really, really key is changing our language from that behavior is wrong to that behavior is not for school. That's a huge difference, because when you say that behavior is wrong and that student knows that it's actually working for them and that they've been taught that either by their friends or by their family or by people who they care about outside of school, then you're essentially invalidating their learning, and they will just turn around and invalidate what you just had to say as well. Monitor and acknowledge pro-social behavior. I've actually spent a good chunk of time, so I'm going to move quickly through this. Obviously, when we have our eyes out for positive behavior, we're going to see more of it. And when we talk about it, we're going to see more of it afterwards as well. You can use the survey that I described. You could also use this modified walkthrough tool with the TFI. It doesn't actually go into scoring, but it actually provides you a little bit more information that you can ask that's more descriptive or qualitative information for students. But the key thing that we know is that we want to be looking for and acknowledging appropriate behavior far more than unwanted behavior. That's why we invest in systems that do that. So here's a little bit of a review of two tools that you can use to assess your equity in acknowledgement systems: the survey and the modified tools as well. Some other key things. It's amazing the research on little things like greeting students at the door by name that teachers can have. It's fantastic. And then getting to know your students as individuals, getting to know their strengths and interests, especially for the ones that you haven't connected particularly well with. We can do this in a few different ways. We can use the survey. Those of you who use or recommend using a student teacher about me poster activity that you place up around the room and that the teacher actually does it as well. It talks about What's my life like? What's my family like? What are the things that I like doing? What are the things I'm good at? And you actually post them all around the classroom so that people can see themselves up on the walls and see positive reflections of them out there. Student interviews, particular students who you're really worried about, that you don't have a good connection with or don't quite get. And then attending the extracurricular events for students. All about those relationships, right? Now, in terms of instructional consequences for unwanted behavior, what we want to watch out for, I don't know how many of you got training from way back in the day, from behavior and classroom management days, and were told just, oh, all you need to do is just ignore the unwanted behavior and it'll just go away. Maybe, but maybe not. So a presenter, Katrina Ayers, talked about this really interesting idea of using, instead of totally ignoring behavior, acknowledging it quickly and then continuing on with the lesson, what she calls quick redirects. So they say, this is stupid. You might say, probably so, or nevertheless. I'm sorry that you have to do this. So a little bit of empathy. You might be right. You may never use this in life. Yes, this is difficult. I hear you. I understand. And then you continue on with the lesson so that it's quick. You've acknowledged the feelings, but you don't get it in the way of actually doing the work. Being really clear, remember that idea of ambiguity as disproportionality's best friend? So really clear guidance about what you're supposed to handle on your own versus what you're supposed to send a student to the office for. And remember to use mild instructional consequences, which are actually just as effective as longer ones. There's some research in, I believe it's Chicago Public Schools, that shorter suspensions worked better than longer suspensions. So there you go. And hopefully even milder than that. The key thing that we want to recognize is that negative consequences that we apply, we want to use to provide more practice for students, to prevent escalation, and then also prevent or minimize reward for the behavior that we don't want to see. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip past a few of these activities so we can actually get you out on time as opposed to holding you late after class, because nobody likes that. This idea, David Yeager and colleagues talked about something called wise feedback, and it's got a few different parts. Critical feedback, communicating high standards to students, and then providing resources to help meet those high standards. What we're trying to do is avoid the situation where a student produces poor quality work, and so we provide critical feedback. They don't take it very, very well and might respond with either unwanted behavior or withdrawal. So we think, oh, well, I ought to just lower my standards because I don't want to deal with that, or withhold critical feedback, right? And the problem is that makes that cycle continue. In the same way, we might do the same thing. We might think, well, this is positive behavior support, so we ought to be really positive. So when a student doesn't do something very well, we ought to overpraise it. And the problem with that is students see right through that, or they think, oh my gosh, I did a terrible job on this, but the person thought it was amazing. Not so good. Student withdraws from school. We're running into the same problem. They don't get access to that critical feedback. So when we do this, I like to think of a wise animal. I think of the owl. And here's an example. Here's bad owl. Here's what bad owl does. Bad owl overpraises mediocre work, withholds constructive feedback, and has low expectations for students. Instead, we want to see good owl, offers critical feedback, with high expectations, and provide something I call a ladder statement, meaning I've got these high expectations for you, and I am going to help you meet those expectations. It's not all on you to meet them. I'm going to provide the extra support that you need to get there. The very last one here is make decisions based on data. you might be familiar, we at the University of Oregon have a discipline data system that is specifically designed to be able to ask and answer equity questions called SWIFT. There's a particular component of it called drill down that's particularly helpful. But even if you're not using SWIFT, we've got a discipline data guide that is available for you that you could use with any discipline system. It talks about what are the things you need and don't, and it's all there available for free for you in the data guide. Some of the components of that are looking at your disaggregated data and also identifying what are specific situations, what are specific discipline incidents where we see big differences in our outcomes. We use this problem-solving, this 4-step problem-solving model that many of you are familiar with. Is there a problem? Why is it happening? What should be done? And is the plan working? And that data guide walks you through those 4 steps. Okay, and so forgive me for going very quickly through those last few. I don't know if we've got time for questions, but I will most certainly answer them as best I can.
So this is Connie, and I just very quickly, because I do recognize that it's 1:30, and some folks may need to leave even though they don't want to, just because they have something else to do. We do have quite a few questions, and we've been gathering them on the side, so we're going to go ahead and continue because we would like to have Kent be able to respond to some of these questions. Some of them may have been answered during the presentation, but that's fine. We'll take a few minutes for that. I want to take a few minutes to thank will be archived, so if you want to come back and hear the answers to the questions or review any of this, please come back to our website and view that. And a real quick thank you to both Kent and to Michael Lombardo and the PBIS Coalition for helping to bring this presentation together for SPP-TAP. We really appreciate the collaborative work on this. So I'm going to give it back to you, Kent, so you can go through the questions. And again, if people need to leave, that's fine, but we'd love to hear your responses to the questions that were posed during the presentation. Okay?
You bet. Okay. Should I just answer the easy ones?
Sure. So you can see them, right? Or would you like us to go through them?
I can. What I can do is I can touch on if anybody keeps asking, if you want to start typing questions in, that's great. What I'll do, if I don't see too many that are coming, is address some of the questions that popped up over time. One of the things was looking at effects of PBIS on attendance and graduation rates. And you can look at research that Jennifer Freeman from the University of Connecticut had on effects of PBIS on both of those outcomes. Let's see. I see a lot of people, if you ask the question, this is just a great community of answering so many of the questions, which is really, really good. Now I'm just going to move here. How do you balance objective discipline practices with the need for flexible, individualized approaches? That is fantastic. This is a really important question, and I think one of the things that you see is in the past, one approach to making discipline decisions as objective as possible with the idea of removing administrator discretion and removing the effect of implicit bias is something called zero tolerance practices. So we've got if we go extreme on the objective and take your hands off of the decision making, we can actually increase. That's actually the best intervention for increasing inequity in education right there. And so what we want to do in terms of being objective is having really clear definitions of what's okay and what's not okay, but not lockstep discipline responses for students. And I think we also want to, when we talk about what's okay and what's not okay, we also want to broaden our definition of okay. So it also includes behavior that we might think of as strange or weird or different, but it's actually just variations on a theme that still handle the idea of pro-social or acceptable. Then what we do is we hold high expectations for student behavior, but we don't lock ourselves into sort of, if you do this, then you get that. We don't want to use the idea of, okay, first offense is this, second offense is that, third offense is that. What we want to do is say, let's look at treating students as individuals and our response to that. Whether we categorize it as an office referral or not is a separate one because we want to be really clear about that. But we've got to treat the specific situations and say, is my response to this going to increase problem behavior or is it going to decrease problem behavior? And that's one of the things that's really, really key. What's in the best interest of this student? Okay, here's a question about integrating mental health supports, or at least Michael sharing resources for that. So please do take a look in the chat box for that. Any other questions out there? Even the hard ones I'm willing to answer.
Do you see, Kent, the ones in the presenter area that say questions and comments in red?
Oh, no, I don't. So that'll be actually really useful for me to actually look at my data. Let me pop that up.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, I caught some of these. That's great.
Yeah.
Do I have a magic bullet for altering adult mindset? I sure don't. But I will say that I have a student who is doing his doctoral dissertation right now on that exact question of how do we change people's commitment to equity, moving from sort of not being interested to being fully committed and supported. And if you are one of those people who has shifted your mindset, he would love to interview you and hear from you. So please send me an email, and I will, let me put my contact info up here. And he would love to hear from you and learn from you, and hopefully we will continue to learn from there. One of the things that I have found that's been useful personally has been, even though many of us look at data and say, oh my gosh, there's these huge disparities and we really want to change those, giving people a concrete strategy to use and try out that's really specific and is tailored to something that would work for them in the classroom, I've found to be much more useful. People's mindsets get fixed when they don't see a solution to the problem. And so if we don't actually provide a strategy to use or something to do differently the next time they're in the classroom, that mindset is going to get more and more fixed. Another one was, let's see, how much disproportionality is based on European-based school frameworks? That is probably worth an hour and a half of conversation. And I would say that I think there is a lot in terms of just the differences in expectations. And if I, as a teacher, don't have much contact with other groups, other racial or ethnic groups, I'm going to be more likely to view something that's different as willful and a problem than I do if I know a little something and understand that behaviors are based on values and they just might not be necessarily my values. So I think that values activity that we talked about, the elements of culture activity, is useful. Another question here. I'll do these last two here that you've got. When we talk about accountability, where does accountability come from? More often than not, people base their discipline approach, and we've got plenty of research on this, on what the school administrator or what the principal says is important. And so in terms of holding people accountable, I do think that the school administrator or the principal is a really pivotal person in that situation, because it's really easy as a teacher in a school to lean back, and if an administrator says, yeah, this is sort of important, but what are we going to do about it? That's going to be something that's not going to work well for enhancing commitment. And then the last one here, how do I explain cultural responsiveness to the parents of two mutual combatants when the consequences are different based on cultural differences? I think one of the things that's really key, and this is where I think when you've got peer-to-peer work, being really skilled, obviously, in using a restorative approach is particularly useful. What you've got to figure out is, when are people able to have a conversation where they're not quite heated so much that they're going to be talking past each other. And I think when we start to identify what are some shared underlying values, while still understanding you might have cultural differences, but resolving those conflicts with your fists is not necessarily an okay way to do that in this school. But having a little bit of a sense of trying to understand the why behind that of a cultural difference doesn't explain it away. It doesn't provide an excuse, but it provides a little bit of an understanding about what happened. And if you are interested in watching an amazing explanation of that, just go on YouTube and type in Rita Pearson and look at a video from her called My Mama Said. And she, the late, great Rita Pearson, will explain it far better than I would on this video.
Okay, I believe we are done. So again, thank you to everyone who stuck around to the very end. And you probably saw that Susan put the little Survey Monkey feedback survey. So we hope that you will take a moment to give us your feedback. It really is like a few very quick questions, so it wouldn't take long at all. We have a community of practice meeting that will include Dr. Kent McIntosh again. That's only for our districts that are significantly disproportionate. So we just put a reminder of the date in our slides here, February 27th at noon. And we have another webinar coming up in May or June. We have not finalized the date yet, and that will be with Dr. Nancy Doan. So everyone will be invited to that.